respect him and honor his righteous principles. But there's no more powerful weapon against evil and unrighteousness than the powerful force of the righteous people of God. That's always been the case. It will always be the case. It'll come down to us as individuals and the sphere of influence we wield. And it'll become like spiritual leaven. It'll spread throughout our communities and our nation. But we've got to make those commitments. I've emphasized as we started the book of Daniel, I've often prayed that I would be a Daniel. God doesn't need Daniels today. He needs Jerry today. Daniel's already lived and carried out his purpose. I'm living today. I need to carry out God's purpose. It's kind of easy to project on someone else what they did or what they should have done and never really say, what should I be doing right now? Those individuals made an entire difference in a whole nation of people. Changed the very course of history of nations because of who they were and their relationship to God. We've looked at those first 5 chapters of the book of Daniel and tried to pull to the surface some of those things that you and I need to learn and be focused on in that context. Last week we looked at chapter 5. As that chapter ended, I reminded you that these are not necessarily in chronological order. In other words, what we'll read in chapter 7 and 8 really come before this chapter 6. Because we're going to read about Darius, is sometimes pronounced, or Darius. And there are 2 different Dariuses that are used here. In the last part of chapter 5, it was seemed to be like we might say governors or someone with special office. There was one from Midian that captured the Babylonians. We mentioned that the Medes and Persians had diverted the water flow so it would get down low enough that they could go under the walls. And while chapter 5 ended by Belteshazzar seeing the handwriting on the wall, and it was summed up by saying, what God is saying to you is you've been weighed in the balances and you've been found wanting. And he died that night. And so the last part of chapter 5 tells us that that very night the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon. This appears to be a different Darius as we open up chapter 6. But now the other one was the conqueror of the land, seemed to be temporary, probably 5 months or so. And now here's someone placed in charge, seemingly of the Babylonian area itself. Not the whole nation of the Medes and Persians, but of Babylon. And so as he's controlling Babylon, he has set over his kingdom, or the kingdom of Babylon. He's placed over those provinces certain individuals, 120 of them that are called princes that can see after the matters of the kingdom. And they're to report then to 3 presidents. That is, higher officials that can kind of filter through and process what they have found out in the kingdom and how they're carrying out the king's commands in the kingdom. And then those presidents report to Darius. And Darius then doesn't have to go around and do all those things. In fact, the context said, so he should have no damage. You see, he reports to Cyrus, who is the king over the whole kingdom. Not just over Babylon. But he reports to Cyrus. And so if he's got other people under him carrying out these affairs, if something goes awry, he's got someone to say, that was their responsibility. I pointed them over that, they didn't carry that out. So he doesn't receive any damage. He's protected. We kind of have that system in our local government, and we kind of have that system in our state government. We have that system in our federal government. We have underlings that carry out the everyday affairs. Rarely does a person in charge have to suffer the damage. It's usually somebody that gets fired underneath him that didn't do their job the way he told them to. Or at least that's how it would be presented. So that's what we have. Among those presidents, there's 3 of them. Among those is Daniel. Are you as fascinated as I am that from the very first of Daniel's experience in captivity, Daniel is favored by his captors. They see him as someone they can trust. You see, he has this mindset, as we've repeated multiple times. He knows that God had blessed his people in Israel, and he had promised to continue to bless them in Israel, in the land of promise, as long as they were obedient to him. But that same God says, if you disobey me, I'm going to curse you. Paul pointed out in his class this morning, there were blessings and curses. God had said to Abraham, I will bless them that bless thee, and I will curse them that curse thee. So the same God that blesses us when we're obedient is that God who will curse us and punish us when we're disobedient. Daniel accepts that. He knows that. You can't trust a God that's not consistent, that doesn't do what he says he's going to do. It's just as important for him to be faithful in carrying out his punishment as it is for him carrying out his blessings. He's consistent in his life. So Daniel is among those who've accepted that God. He knew that God said you're going to go into captivity and you're going to remain there 70 years. He gets there, he's not saying, how many days have we got? How many days have we got? He knows how many days he has. 70 years of captivity. So what are you going to do while you're there? God's already said, plant your garden, build your houses. You're going to be there 70 years. He accepts those terms, and people around him see him going on about the business. And they keep elevating him. Now here, not only has the Babylonians carried him into captivity, but now the Babylonians have been dethroned. And now a new kingdom comes in, that very kingdom that Daniel had prophesied would come. Babylon was a head of fine gold, and now we have that breast and arms of silver, the Medo-Persians. But who's still the same? Daniel. These are new people in charge. But who do they automatically recognize is a person they can trust? And so what we want to look at this morning is to be more consistent in our life the way Daniel was consistent in his life. Zach read for us those first 5 verses. If you listen to that, you see a pattern in Daniel's life of him being faithful to the Lord. And these patterns that are recorded, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, it said these things happen unto them as an example. And then it said, in reference to that, and they are written for our admonition. They're written to cause us to say, that applies to us. Just like those people responded to God in obedience, and God blessed them and God used them, the same will be true of us. So there are examples. They're intended to get our attention and to cause us to learn the lessons. And so there's a pattern set forth in Daniel's life. He's consistent. As you listen to Zach reading, you might have noticed that when you get specifically looking at verse 3, it said, and this Daniel, being one of those 3 presidents, and this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and the princes because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king thought to set him over his whole realm. From the time he was taken captive to these new captors assessing their captives, Daniel stood out. He's just going about his business, doing the right thing in the right way. He's not promoting himself. He's not trying to become a president. He's just doing what God told him to do. You go into that captivity and you show him who my people are. And you be content to be there because you know why you're there, but also be aware that after those 70 years, I'm going to send my people back home. Guess who will send them home? The one who just captured Babylon, Cyrus. Before he ever came, Isaiah allows God, or God uses Isaiah to say, Cyrus, my servant. Before Cyrus ever came on the scene, God called his name. God said he's going to be my servant. So here's Daniel in that land, and here's this new captor, this new ruler over Babylon. And he looked at all these princes and all these presidents, and he preferred Daniel. Now, why is that? Sometime when new bosses come to town, or new people are elected, you have a certain group of people that kind of smooth them, you know. They want to be the first ones to go to the reception. They want to be the first ones to get their ear, and they begin to kind of promote themselves. That's not the indication with Daniel at all. They paid attention. Did he carry out his job? Can you trust him? And Daniel appears to be doing what he's supposed to do all the time. Different people come on the scene who are in a position of authority, and they recognize Daniel. They prefer Daniel. He's not pushing himself, but notice what happens here. Here's this consistency in his life. We want to be more consistent in our life. That's what I've tried to focus on all year long. I hope I've done that over my life, but this year I was determined, not just to make some New Year's resolution and then keep it or not keep it and say, well, I'll try that again. Maybe that'll be my resolution for next year. I'm going to keep doing it till I get it done, to say, I'm going to pay attention this year. And I want to do just a little more to focus on who I am in my relationship to the Lord. I'm going to take that picture of myself. And I took it on January the 1st. And every now and then this is a mental image that I've taken. In case you're visiting, say, where's the picture? I took a mental image and just kind of assessed, what am I doing? What can I do better? What can I do more of? Now, there are a lot of things you can do. And as a congregation, we're interconnected, so there are a lot of things we could do for each other, and we can't do everything for each other, but can I do a little more and try to encourage the work of the Lord and be an example of that encouragement? Again, we may all have perspective. I might have a perspective of you and say, well, you know, this person has a lot of talent and ability. Boy, things they could be doing. Wow. If they would just do this, it'd make everything so much better for the congregation. And wow, if everybody in the congregation could learn from them, and maybe, just maybe, I spend my time focusing on what you could do better. And maybe I prepare my sermons to say, just tell them what they could be doing better. And just preach it in such a way that you don't call their name, but you describe it so vividly they think, he was talking to me. He's telling me, here's what I need to do. Well, you see, you don't see Daniel doing that. You know what you see Daniel doing? What Daniel can do. And people notice Daniel's getting about doing marvelous things. So this year has been spent with Jerry Martin. Just keep looking in the mirror. What can I do better? And maybe if I do what I need to do better, maybe it would inspire you to do better. Now again, you may have a perspective of me of what I ought to be doing, and that's okay. And I'd certainly be open to you telling me what I could do better, because I do want to do it better. But I would caution all of us to say, make this personal. Let's look at our own spiritual image and say, what can I improve here? So I look more and more like the image of God that he created me to be. So Daniel is there. So he's persistent. We get this picture of Daniel. He's very consistent. Everybody sees him the same way. Not some kind of political maneuvering so he gets in a position that he'd be blessed. He's just Daniel. He'd already purposed in his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself. He's Daniel. And now you have Daniel in this chapter, though we won't cover it a whole lot this morning. We'll use that tonight when we look at the lessons from Daniel chapter 6. But this is Daniel in the lion's den. That's what this chapter is. And most of us, probably all of our life, we see those images of Daniel and we see him in that lion's den. We don't know the context. We don't know that he's in the lion's den because he's just being Daniel. And he's being elevated. And here's the ruler saying, I prefer Daniel. I want to put him over all the presidents and over all the princes because I can trust Daniel. If you, in your well-being, were dependent upon me, could you trust it? If the elder said, Jerry, here's what we need you to do, could they trust that I would do it to the best of my ability? Would they say, you can you can count on him carrying it out. And we wouldn't receive any damage back because he would cut the corners, or could they do that? You see, Daniel is not seeking any kind of position. He's not seeking any kind of recognition, but he just naturally comes. Here's this new king or this new ruler in Babylon, and he wants to promote him. And so this persistent life stands out. When you look at that in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8, it says of our Lord that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I count on that. How about you? I count on my Lord being the same all the time. We're told in James chapter 1 and verse 17 that every good and every perfect gift comes down from above, from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Here's this consistency. We might even say this persistence of life. You can count on it. Always going to be that way. Now, if I'm created in God's image, and Christ is my example, then I need to be the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. Not saying, well, that's who I am, I really can't change it. We're talking about a spiritual context. We're talking about being like our Creator because we were created in His image. And if He doesn't change, we shouldn't change and adapt to the situation and say, well, that used to be considered wrong, but, it's not considered wrong anymore, so I'm just going to adapt to that. That's not the image of God. That's not what we want God to do. He promised us salvation. We don't want Him to change His mind and say, well, that's who I used to be, but, I kind of enjoy punishing people now. We want Him to reward us if we're obedient. We depend upon that. His consistency and His persistence in being holy and right. But I have to then, as we noticed last week from 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 15, I have to be holy as He is holy. When? All the time. So my choices then become clear. If I'm trying to say, should I do this or should I do that? Well, which would allow me to be more like God and serve Him at a higher level? Then my choices become clear. If I say, what do I want? What have I always wanted? Now all of a sudden it gets blurred a little bit and God gets left out of it, and I say, can I try that? Wonder what that would do. Boy, people seem to be enjoying that. Maybe if I just, Daniel is focused upon spending his 70 years in captivity serving the Lord. People noticed it. And people utilized that. People respected that. But not everybody respected that. So in those first 5 verses, you see the persistent life that Daniel lived. When you get to chapter 5 through verse 9, you see the prejudicial plot that was in place. There's going to be people who resent you being comfortable serving God and happy serving God. They're going to resent that. They're going to say, those are goody two-shoed people, they just always act like they're doing the right thing. And, that's a put on. Now, whatever about Daniel, they recognize this is not a put on. He doesn't ever change. But listen to what they say. In reference to that, in verse 5 it said, then said these men, talking about those other presidents and princes, then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Would you like for people to look at you that way? Say, if we're going to trap him in some way, we're going to have to make sure we do that in their consistent, persistent faithfulness to their God in doing the right thing. They said, that's the only way we're going to trap him. So what do? They manipulate the laws of the land to be in conflict with the law of God, and they already know which choice Daniel's going to make. Would people know that about me? Would they say, the only way we're going to trap Jerry Martin is to have something that's contrary to his God's law? And if we make something in conflict to that, we know he's not going to compromise. And so we'll have him. Now, we live in a day when there's a lot of hostility toward religion, toward Christians. And the terminology gets into the world. They take a context in life that needs to be addressed. There's a lot of prejudice and hate, and it should not be tolerated in a society. But you see, when that prejudice and hate is against God's principles and God's people, you can work it into the law and say anything that would come from the mouths of those who claim to be preaching the Bible, and it condemns sin, they'll put a image with that. And they'll put a person who is practicing that sin, and all of a sudden any word that you say, that would be hate speech toward that person who's practicing that sin. That sound familiar? You see, we look at Daniel and say, wow, what a man. Here we are. Would you just be consistent in your life, and the only way they trap you is for you being consistent in your life? You being who God wants you to be? Or do you just get caught up in some kind of political election to say, boy, if we could just do this, everything would change? And say, no, this is who I need to be. And would they know the only way to trap me would be to create a law that would be contrary to God's law? Not the first time, not the last time that these things have happened. So here's this prejudice that they have. And they knew that Daniel prayed constantly. They already knew that. That's what he's already doing. But Daniel knew. They knew. He wasn't doing it for them. They knew he wasn't doing it for them. And so if they could go in before the king, now these are people that the king's supposed to be able to trust. These are people that he's elevated to take care of matters so he doesn't receive any damage. And so they manipulate things. In verse 5 through verse 9, they go and say, let's draw up a law. Because see, they got new rulers. And the Medes and the Persians, if you made a law, it couldn't be changed. Can't alter the law. Sounds a little bit like the law of God, doesn't it? Can't alter the law. So they said, let's make this a law that anybody that would make a petition would pray to anybody other than you, king. They're trying to elevate him and smooth him and say, if anybody prays to anyone but you for the next 30 days, he should be thrown in the lion's den. Seems pretty innocuous, doesn't it? Who's going to do that? Daniel's going to do that. They know Daniel is going to do that. And here are these prejudicial plotters saying, that's the only way we're going to get him. Because he's going to continue to pray. He's going to pray to his God. The only way we're going to get him is something to do with the law of his God. It's the law of his God. Would call upon him to do that. You and I would have the backgrounds. We've been studying through the scriptures. When we get a little further along in these men and women of the Old Testament, you'll see that when Solomon builds a temple and he dedicates a temple, when you look at the context of 1 Kings chapter 8, he calls attention to that. And he's asking God, now, from this time forward, this temple can't hold you. But this is a house for you to come and meet us. And if you will sanctify this house, if you're present to be in this house, from now on, if your people are taken captive and they're in a foreign land, if they will turn toward this house and pray to you, please hear their prayer, forgive their sins, and heal their land. Daniel's a captive. All these years later, he's a captive. So what's he going to do? He's going to turn toward Jerusalem, where the house of God was. He's going to pray. So God could hear his prayer, forgive his sins, and heal his land. These 70 years will be over. The temple will be rebuilt. God's people will be healed in that land. But Daniel's praying, and so they manipulate that. That's what they're trying to do, and it reminds us of a number of circumstances that we ought to pray more. I ought to pray more. To purposefully pray more. In Psalm 55 and verse 17 is the backdrop, the background of one of the songs we sing sometime. Morning, noon, and evening, ever will I pray. What was Daniel doing? Praying 3 times a day with his face turned toward Jerusalem. They knew it. That's the only way we're going to get him. And so they manipulated the law to say, if anybody does that, throw him in the lion's den. Well, like a lot of rulers, sometimes if you trust those that you put in position, they type off all these forms and put the wherewith and hereafters and heresoever. Okay, sign right here. All right, sign the pen, give somebody the pen. We kind of do those little ceremonial things, and what's in there? You remember when we told the health care law was being passed, and somebody said, what's in it? What's in it? Said, we'll have to wait till it's passed and we'll read it. That's kind of what the king did. He didn't really, he heard it, but he didn't know the motive behind it. What's the purpose behind this? He just signed it. These are his elevated people. These are people he's supposed to be able to trust. And so that prejudice plot put Daniel in harm's way. You know, the New Testament deals with prejudice, doesn't it? In Acts chapter 9, you have Paul that was prejudiced toward Christians and persecuting them. And God showed him the way. And he's told, rise and be baptized and wash away his sin. Peter was told in Acts chapter 10, don't call that which God has cleansed common and unclean. He's preparing him to go to the Gentile world. And when he got to Cornelius' house in Acts chapter 10 and verse 34, he said, I perceive that God is no respecter of person, but in every nation, he that obeyeth God shall be received of God. These folks' prejudice caused them to put Daniel in harm's way. Then you have in verse 10 through verse 19, the king from that time forward being powerless. Sometimes prejudice will put innocent people in a position where they can't do anything about it, and people who would normally do something about it are in harm's way. We mentioned that hate speech. You know, if you put it in the law and you let it be vague enough, it can be applied by anybody at any time. And all of a sudden we're live streaming our sermons, and somebody's looking for information, like these people were, to take Christians and trap them and say, you know what that preacher that preaches for the Pine Street Church of Christ said? And they'll take something out that might be a condemnation of a lifestyle. And they'll say, all these people out here that practice this lifestyle, he said, here's what ought to happen to them. Now, that's likely not what I said at all. Likely I would just quote what God said in the Scriptures about our lifestyle and what's acceptable and what's unacceptable, which would apply to all of us. But those who are practicing it said, that was hateful toward me. So what would the law say? Whatever the punishment for hate speech is, apply that to you. So it's not too vague for us to understand where Daniel was. He's not causing anybody else to have to pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem, but that's what he's doing. He's persistent about it. The prejudice toward him caused them to put him in a way where he could be harmed. In verse 17, now this is a story where he goes and tells the king, guess what? It seemed to be pretty quick, doesn't it? Because it said, when Daniel knew it had been signed, what did he do? Well, what he'd always done. He didn't do it just because it was signed. It's saying he knew those things were going on. Do you and I know that there are things going on? That people are prejudiced toward Christians? Would that make us uncomfortable and say, well, I need to kind of keep that under wraps? That's how I believe. That's really how I feel, but I probably don't need to tell anybody that's how I feel. If the subject comes up, I probably need to just not say anything. And if we're doing things in the community and I say, well, I really can't participate in that. Or, no, it's Sunday and I go to worship. If I'm consistent about that, and people are prejudiced toward that? Would I change because of their prejudice? Daniel didn't. When he knew it was signed, he went and did what he'd always done. As soon as that happened, they said, we got him. They took it back to the king, said, this is your law. It can't be changed. The law of the Medes and Persians can't be changed. And so here's what this man did. And when he's describing it, and the king's saying, okay, who is it? Daniel. Immediately, he knew that he had not really read that and understanding the application of that. And he was saddened by that. And it says that about the king. When he heard these things in verse 14, was sore displeased with himself. I've always admired that about Darius. You know, he was displeased with himself. Now, even though you got people in charge of things and you're going to trust them in those things, you're still responsible for those things. He said, what would be the application of that? How would that affect everybody? Is there somebody you think disrespects me or wouldn't keep this law? He was just pleased with himself, and he tried to find ways to deliver him, but because of the law of the Medes and Persians, couldn't do it. So you have a powerless king. Can't really do the right thing, the right reason. So what happened? Throw Daniel in the lion den. Now you don't see Daniel, them having to drag him, and he gets his heels in the dirt, and they're having to pull him up there and pull him up there. Daniel just goes. That's the law. If it's going to keep me from praying to my God, throw him in a lion den. I don't know about you, and some of you in other classes have told me you didn't have the same image, but the image I remember in my Bible classes of Daniel in the lion den, he was a young man in the lion den. Do you know Daniel is from 80 to 85 years old when he's thrown in the lion den? He's about 15 when he gets into captivity. That's kind of the way I picture him. He's down in a lion den, you know, this young man. No, he's an old man. He'd been there almost 70 years. So when Cyrus is the one that lets him go home. So Cyrus is ruling now, and Daniel's an old man, but he's a consistent old man, isn't he? He's very persistent in how he serves his God, and so his God's always delivered him. His God's always taken care of him. His God's always promoted him. His God's always used him. He's not worried about the circumstances of life. I want to be more like that. Say, well, what if that happens? Boy, I hope that doesn't happen. Well, it shouldn't matter whether it happens or not. What am I going to do in response to whatever happens? Serve God. So they put him in that lion den, and we'll develop this more tonight. But they seal it. And you would know, wouldn't you, that the lions are not fed every day, so they're not hungry, sitting around licking their paws. They want to eat. And he's cast over in there, and that king doesn't sleep that night, and he doesn't have his musicians come in and try to soothe him that night. He wants to feel the decision he made that displeased him. And he stays up, worried about Daniel, rushes to ask if Daniel's still there. But the sealing of the mouth of that lion's den, for what? I don't care if Daniel was 85 years old. If it's just Daniel, he wanted to get out of there, he'd come get this little youthful energy about him and try to get away from the lions. But if you seal the top, there's no way to get out. What's the purpose? And so Daniel's sealed in the lion den. Can't get out. The scriptures doesn't say he screamed all night. Everything seemed to be quiet. So quiet, it bothers the king. But the king goes to the mouth of the cave and he asks Daniel, has your God delivered you? Automatically you see this persistent life that Daniel has lived. That will allow him to be preferred by the king, to place over everything in the kingdom. Made him desperately want Daniel's God to deliver him. I want to live my life in such a way that people respect my God. That if something happens to me in life, they would say, Jerry, I hope your God delivers you from that. I hope God takes care of you because how we feel about you and how you've treated us. I want that kind of image of those around me. That they would immediately have confidence in my God. This king seemed to. Daniel, has your God delivered you? He seemed to be so elated when Daniel said, He delivered me. He stopped the lion's mouth. They got lockjaw. Couldn't do anything about it. We want to pause there and we'll finish the lesson tonight. But isn't that an astounding story? Not just a children's story. This is an old man who'd been persistent all of his life from the time he was a young man in captivity, been faithful to the Lord in all kinds of circumstances, all kinds of rulers, all kinds of co-workers, all kinds of manipulations, all kinds of challenges. And he's sitting there in the lion's den, confident in his God. And God delivered him. You see, when people who resist God and want to punish God's people, then they want something very ferocious to intimidate them. We're told in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 that we're to be sober, to be vigilant, for our adversary, the devil, walketh about as a roaring lion, seeking whom may devour. But you see, we're not in a cave. We're in life. And we can be sober and be vigilant and avoid the lion, spiritually speaking. He was placed inside a cave with hungry lions, wanting to devour him. And God delivered him. We're told in Matthew chapter 27 that when the prejudicial Jews, in their hate for the Lord, lied about him and placed him before a heathen court and accused him of not being Caesar's friend, and that if Pilate didn't put him to death, Pilate wasn't Caesar's friend. And because of that, Jesus was put to death. But the prejudicial people weren't really sure how all that was going to turn out. And so after Jesus was placed in the tomb, they went to Pilate and said, look, make sure the cave, the tomb, seal it. Because while he was alive, he said, the deceiver said, the third day he would be raised. In case his disciples uses that, seal the cave, seal the tomb. And they did. In both cases, man's sealing of the matter didn't seal anything, did it? Because God was in charge then. God is in charge now. The cave didn't hold Daniel. The tomb didn't hold Christ. And we get to choose sides, don't we? If you're here this morning and not a child of God, this is a God who takes care of his people. This is a God who allows his people to live their best lives and do the best things for the most people. If you have faith in his Son as being the Son of God, if you're willing to turn away from your sins in repentance, if you are willing, confess with your name that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and you're willing to submit your life to him in baptism, your past life will be washed away. And you can arise to walk in newness of life. Hopefully, all of us would see that new life as being a life like Daniel's was. Totally, consistently committed to the Lord. Courageous in the face of danger, and confident in every circumstance of life. Those of us who are children of God, I hope our journey this year thus far has caused us to stand in front of that spiritual mirror, as James chapter 1 and verse 5 says, whosoever looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, being not a forgetful hearer, but a doer of the work, this man shall be blessed in his deed. Daniel was a blessed man because he kept looking in that mirror How about you this morning? Will you come to Jesus while we stand and while we sing?
Lord, I have wandered so far from the fold, sin sick and weary, I'm lost in the cold. Still there is pardon for me, I am told. Lord, I am coming to Thee, coming to Thee with a soul sin defiled, coming for pardon to be reconciled. Open thine arms to a poor wayward child. Lord, I am coming to Thee. Hours I have spent in the night of despair, hungry and lonely where none seem to care. Yet in thy house there is bread and to spare. Lord, I am coming to Thee, coming to Thee with a soul sin defiled, coming for pardon to be reconciled. Open thine arms to a poor wayward child. Lord, I am coming to Thee. Since there is pardon, O Lord, let me be only a servant at home and with Thee. In deep contrition, thy mercy my plea. Lord, I am coming to Thee, coming to Thee with a soul sin defiled, coming for pardon to be reconciled. Open thine arms to a poor wayward child. Lord, I am coming to Thee.